Now what we want to look at are some of the New Testament or Gospel manuscripts. The earliest illuminated Christian manuscripts. The first one we're going to look at is probably the earliest extant illustrated gospel from the 6th century. It's the Rossano Gospels from the Cathedral Library, now from the Archbishop's Museum, originally in the Cathedral of Rossano in Italy. The origins are disputed. Different people think that it may have been made in different places. Most likely, at least in my opinion, it would have been made in Constantinople. And I say that because the purple manuscript suggests a member of the imperial family as a patron. And one of the things you'll notice is the style derives from classical tradition, figures that turn in space, that are shaded to look three-dimensional. But the proportions are becoming more slender, perhaps taking a step toward Byzantine, which we talked about Byzantine art from the 6th century on. So presumably copying and then adapting earlier manuscript illuminations. The image that you're looking at right now, at the top, it shows the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. And then down below you see 4 half-length figures pointing down at the text and then pointing up at the image. These would be presumably the evangelists, and it's a kind, or Old Testament prophets, who hold texts and point to the scene at the top. The Christians believe that the Old Testament prophets foretold the coming of Christ, and that in the Old Testament you would find verses that relate to Christ. So at the top we see no frame, but we do see a ground line once again, and we do see this little doorway. In this case it's a closed door, so we want to see what's going on both sides, and we'll look at a detail in a moment. You'll see that the figures certainly are have gestures that tell us what's going on. So here we have the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. This is a parable that Christ told in Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. It's a parable of the Last Judgment. In the story, he talks about virgins who are waiting with their lamps to accompany the bridegroom in a procession to the wedding feast. And half of the virgins brought extra oil for their lamps. They were prudent. The others ran out of oil, and then they had to leave and go buy more oil. Well, while they were gone, the bridegroom comes by, and the wise virgins who have enough oil for their lamp attend the procession and come to the wedding feast. The foolish virgins arrive late. They had to go out and buy more oil. And when they come, they find the door shut against them, and they are turned away. And the moral of the story is that no one knows when the last days will be. And if you are unprepared, you will not be allowed into the kingdom of heaven. Now, we say that Christ tells this parable and he talks about the bridegroom, but here Christ himself is the bridegroom. You can see that the male figure has a halo. He's a bearded image of Christ. He's wearing a gold garment, and he is telling the foolish virgins that they have to leave. You may notice that the wise virgins are wearing white to show their purity. Their torches are still burning, and they're entering into a kind of paradisial garden rather than a building laid out with a wedding feast. We see the 4 rivers of paradise at their feet. We see trees with either blossoms or fruit behind them. The foolish virgins look, very festive, actually. They are all dressed in different colors, but this distinguishes them, maybe a little more worldly, from the white-garbed wise virgins. one of the very interesting scenes, there's several scenes of the trial of Christ in the Rossano Gospels. And so here we see Christ on the lower level before Pilate. It's a full-page miniature, and you'll notice at the top there seems to be a semicircle, that the figures surrounding Pilate suggest this kind of semicircle. One of the ideas is that this may not reproduce a manuscript image, but may be a reproduction of a very famous monumental wall painting, which of course no longer exists, so we can't compare it, but that would have been placed either in an apse or a lunette, hence the semicircle. Lorche suggests that it would have been a mural at the pilgrimage site of the Domus Pilati, the Praetorium in Jerusalem, the house of Pilate. And one of the things that we notice is that it does represent a Roman court. You see Pilate as a judge, and remember that the judge would have been sitting in an apse of a basilica in many cases. And that there are these standards with bust portraits on behind him, and then there's a table in front of him that has, the cloth hanging down has two more of these bust portraits. We believe that, these portraits are the Latron. Let me see if I can pronounce it. L-A-R-A-T-O-N. That these portraits are the Lauraton, the imperial portraits, which represent the emperor's visual presence and confer authority on the judge. I mean, if you're off in Judea, the emperor is not going to show up for your court case, but his image is there. So at the top, we see Pilate elevated above the others. And below, we see Christ and Barabbas. Barabbas is on the far left. He's leaning over. He's been tied with his hands behind his back. Christ is the largest figure. He's dressed in a golden mantle, and he is erect and dignified. Barabbas, who is a criminal, bent over, he's half naked. There's a great distinction between them. And you'll remember that Pilate offered to release one of the prisoners, the thief and murderer Barabbas or Jesus, and the crowd called for the release of Barabbas, and Pilate says, well, what should I do with this other guy? And it's crucify him. So on either side of Pilate, in two curving arcs, we have the mob calling for Christ's execution. Now we have a second image of Christ before Pilate, and here the the photograph makes the purple manuscript look gray. I apologize. As I said, it seems like every time you find an image, it has a slightly different colored background. This is another image of Christ before Pilate. At the top, he's being led in. And at the bottom, we see Judas. Judas, you remember, sold Christ, identified Christ for 30 pieces of silver. The Bible doesn't tell you why. There's some speculation that he thought that this would make Jesus perform a miracle and reveal himself as the Messiah. But at any rate, it didn't work out the way he thought. He is horrified at what he has done, that Christ will be killed. And so he returns the 30 pieces of silver. He throws it down because they don't want to take back the money. It's considered to be blood money. It's tainted. And then on the lower right, you see the tree bent over with the suicide of Judas, where he hangs himself. Here we see two other scenes earlier than the trial, in which we have the entry into Jerusalem. And I want to point some things out because over and over you'll see some of these same elements in the entry into Jerusalem. Christ, of course, riding a donkey or a colt. the apostles behind him, people throwing their cloaks down, all of which is mentioned in the Bible. And here you also have the city of Jerusalem with people waving branches from the battlements, actually, and figures that look like little children coming out of the city. Below is the Last Supper. It reminds us a little bit of those catacomb paintings, which we thought were possibly, the banquet of the afterlife or representation of the agape feast. Some people had suggested they were Last Suppers, but they didn't show a figure that could be signaled out as Christ, and they usually had too few figures. This was definitely a Last Supper. We see Christ reclining at the table, and of course the table is shown here as a kind of half circle. We can look down on it, and we can look straight at the figures of the apostles. Christ, once again, he's shown as a king, as a ruler, as an emperor, with his golden garment and his very large disc halo. And later on we'll be seeing the Last Supper mosaic in the Church of San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, which has the same iconographic form. Here's some things to compare. Okay. Here you see our catacomb pictures. Compare them to the Rossano Gospels, and you see above an image from a mosaic, that a 6th century mosaic in the Church of San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna. So you have essentially the painted version and the mosaic version. Been looking at all of these imperial purple manuscripts. This particular scene, and I'm not showing you the whole page, we're kind of focusing in on the image, but it is a full page miniature. Known as the Rabula Gospels. You'll see it spelled both with 2 B's and with 1 B. And it dates from 586. It is dated. It is signed. Rabula was the name of the scribe who signed and dated the manuscript. He was a monk at the monastery of St. John at Zagba in what is today Syria. The manuscript is in Syrian or Aramaic. It is a Peshitta, which is the Aramaic Bible. And the parchment is the natural color of parchment, not purple. It's not an imperial commission. It would have been made for this monastery way out in Syria. And we do have some pages where the entire pages are illustrated. As you see here. The style reflects, once again, this classical illusionistic model where you have figures that are shaded in light and dark, they turn in space. There's even a suggestion of an atmospheric, impressionistic landscape, and the mountains behind the crucifixion and those trees behind the resurrection of Christ at the lower level. They kind of remind me of the trees that we saw sometimes next to the Good Shepherd in catacomb painting, but very, very freely painted. And so a kind of impressionistic landscape. However, at the same time, if we look closely at the figures, there is a move toward Byzantine linearity with very solid outlines. And if you think about it, if somebody is copying a picture, they might outline it first. They may make it very precise and then, paint it in. So, although you can't say that shows copying, it's certainly one possibility. Here we're looking at the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. We've looked at a few crucifixions before in which Christ was erect on the cross. And we said that these were Christ triumphant, Christus triumphans. He is triumphant over sin and over death. And in this case, it's particularly emphasized because he is definitely alive on the cross. He's erect. His eyes are open. He's not hanging down. He's not suffering. Interestingly enough, he actually wears a purple tunic, a colobium, which is an imperial garment. And once again, purple is the sign of an emperor. So it shows Christ as the king with emphasis on his divinity. Mary, what? The mother of God, the queen of heaven, also wears the purple imperial garment, and we see her, as we'll see, a number of times on this page. Christ, Mary, and the angel all have gold disc halos. And you have a lot of narrative details. At the top, you have at the feet of Christ, at the feet of the cross, you have the soldiers playing dice, trying to win his garment. On one side, you have Longinus piercing Christ's side. On the other, you have the figure that's often known as Stephaton. Once again, that name is not in the Bible, but Stephaton, who is offering vinegar on a sponge. Christ says, "I thirst," and they put up a spear or a lance with a sponge that's been soaked in vinegar for him to take it, to drink from. We see Mary on the far left in her purple garment with her gold disc halo with St. John. And then, of course, the two thieves are being crucified on either side of Christ, slightly lower. And then on the far right of the upper register, you see the holy women, the three Marys. Down below, you see several scenes of the resurrection. Now, in the Bible, the resurrection is described in several ways. One is the Marys, the holy women, come to the tomb of Christ on Sunday morning. They are going to anoint the body. And instead of finding the body, they are greeted by an angel who tells them that Christ has risen. The other story, which is in the Gospel of St. John, is Mary Magdalene comes also to anoint the body of Christ, finds the tomb empty. She's weeping. She sees a man that she thinks is the gardener and says, "If you have taken his body, tell me where you have laid it." And the man speaks to her. He says, "Mary." And it's Jesus. She recognizes him. She reaches out to touch him. And of course he says, "Touch me not. I have not yet ascended to the Father." Well, you can see both of those scenes there. And in the center, you have the tomb with these sort of rays of power coming out of it and knocking over the soldiers who are guarding the tomb. And then on the left, you see the angel speaking to the Marys. And on the right, you see Christ speaking to the Marys again. And I said the Marys again. You'll notice that Mary, the mother, wearing her purple garment and having the golden halo, is in both of those scenes. The Bible doesn't say Mary the mother came, but here she is shown among the holy women. And it doesn't say that Mary Magdalene was accompanied by Mary, the mother, but here Mary the mother is kneeling before Christ with Mary Magdalene behind her. So there's a little liberties taken. I'm curious about this. I know later on in the 15th century there is a scene of Christ appearing to Mary the mother because they just couldn't believe that he wouldn't have done that. So it becomes part of the devotional text. I'm wondering if this was the first example of that, at least that has survived. So here's the details, as you can see. You might notice that the frame around it looks like weaving patterns. And here you see the figures below, and you can see we have two Marys, but one is the mother, and then we have two Marys again, and one is the mother. And I think here, as you're looking at this too, you can see what we were talking about. The figures are a little bit more elongated. They are outlined. The drapery folds often are lines. And yet at the same time, the way they turn, suggests space. And you can see the angel with this foreshortened knee comes up. And yes, it's flattened, but you can see this certainly is probably derived from an illusionistic image, this the thinking three-dimensionally. There's another image, a full-page scene in the Rabula Gospels, and this is the Ascension. And this is really a fascinating scene. You can read about the Ascension of Christ in Acts 1. And here, basically Christ goes up to Mount Olivet. You can read about the Ascension in Acts 1. Basically, Christ goes up to Mount Olivet accompanied by the apostles. He gives them the mission of the apostles, go out and preach to all the world. And then he rises up into heaven. And the apostles are staring up into heaven when an angel talks to them and says to them, "Men of Galilee, why are you looking up to heaven? Don't you know that Christ will come again?" So there's a kind of tying of the earthly Christ who rises up to heaven, and the idea of the ascension being a kind of he will come again as he went. It's a kind of second, it refers to the second coming. So there is some really interesting imagery that we don't really get from the story as it says in the Bible. Here Christ is rising up into heaven in an aureole, which has at the base these wings with eyes on them. It has wheels within wheels, these circular bands, and then the heads of the four living creatures, the tetrarch, which are seen in the vision of God, of Ezekiel's vision of God. The wheels aren't mentioned in St. John's vision. So these are specifically from Ezekiel's vision of God. So you're having this heavenly scene. You have angels flying up on either side of him. And then below, you see the angels standing on the ground talking to the apostles, one of them pointing up to heaven, saying that Jesus will come again as he went. One of the other interesting things that we see very frequently in images of the Ascension going on many, many centuries into the future is an image of Mary. And Mary is not mentioned being there in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, she is mentioned at being at a gathering after the Ascension, and this may have been why they put her in, or just she's so important, of course she'd be there, seeing her son go up to heaven. We just assume it has to be. But Mary is certainly emphasized. She stands in the orant, or praying position, or prayerful position, right beneath Christ. There's a kind of parallel. She's as large as Christ, and so we see that Mary is is very important in the Rabula Gospels. She's given sort of extra places of honor. The imagery is extremely sophisticated, and for many people this seems to be too sophisticated for a way out in the middle of nowhere monastery, way out in the middle of Syria, away from any major metropolitan area. And so it has been suggested that the prototype for these images may be monumental wall paintings, whether they're monumental wallpapers that were copied into a manuscript and then were copied, or whether they were a monumental wall painting from a pilgrimage site in the Holy Land, and then were incorporated into this book. So here we have a pilgrimage flask from the 6th century. You could buy these with a little bit of holy oil in them as a souvenir of your journey to the pilgrimage site. And you can see the same imagery with Christ in the center, Mary below. A souvenir image, quite possibly reproducing a famous image that's on a wall that no longer exists, but certainly very similar iconography here.